The Melissae were nursemaids to the infant Zeus, but why were they chosen? And what does it take to prepare a child destined to change the face of humanity for his future? Melissae were the nursemaids of Zeus. That's what AI will tell you. It'll give you 2 or 3 sentences about that, but not much substance. And so I spent months looking for the substance. One of the questions I'm interested in understanding is, first of all, what it took to be a Melissae. Why would a goddess choose this particular set of women to look after her child? Because it happens so many times. Also, when you're in there, what does it feel like to be Melissae, to be a Melissa, to be in charge of this child that will change the face of history? So his destiny is to wipe out the Titans and to bring in the Olympic gods. And to do that, he has got to essentially overcome his father, who thinks he is dead. So to protect him, what's involved in that? So AI will tell you that they were chosen because they knew the honey mysteries, that they knew that they could nourish him with honey. But surely there's more than that. We've got to protect him against the Titans. We've got to make sure he's got enough to eat. If he's eating honey and incidentally goat's milk, we know that there is a goat goddess in there too. I won't necessarily talk today, but we will look at the goat goddess Almathea at a later date. And we hear that Melissa is her name, that the woman seems to be a representation when you read it, that the nymph in the cave is called Melissa, but surely there's more than one. The Oracle of Delphi, for example, worked in shifts. There was always 3 in any shift at any time. So can we find these women? So this is the beginning of that part of the journey into the cave. So the first thing to know is that there are 2 caves. And you should really sort of centre this, knowing that these 2 caves are not just in a story. These are places of pilgrimage. These are places of ritual. These are places where there are actual priestesses. There are actual prophetic practices. In the Dictean Cave, for example, there are prophets in there who channel Zeus because he's believed to be in there. King Minos, who built the labyrinth for the Minotaur, he goes there and Zeus speaks to him. There's like a specific ritual that goes, I think it's every 9 years. I have to check the notes. But these are actual rituals that take place. And when you look at the archaeology, you can see where people have left offerings. You can see the things that they have left to go with the prayers that they said, because they absolutely believed that these deities were in these places. So they are bedtime stories, but they are more than that. And so I'm really fascinated. I think some of the traditions will say that he was in there for a year. And you saw in the Homeric hymn of Hermes, and we talked about Parnassus, gods grow quick, right? So it might not have been so long that they were in there, but we know that Zeus was in the cave long enough to grow strong enough to have the intellect and the bodily power to overcome the king of the Titans. So that's not necessarily a job for a child, right? And so in that time, what does it take to look after this child who, well, I would say doesn't really like women? When we read about the Zeus, you know, through the ages, he's always about chasing the nymphs, you know. His wife is always having to challenge and deal with nymphs because he's come on to them. So he's a very tricky character. So what does it involve? So just show you the sort of one of the cards I wrote to myself. It says, Mysteries of Autonomy. I've said in other videos, Autonomy is a Melissa, but she's not from Zeus. She's from Dionysus. She was Dionysus' nursemaid. But her name means thinking outside the box, and believing in your own gnosis. In other words, when you investigate things within your thoughts, that is valid, right? So mysteries of autonomy, initiations into the Melissae. They are not mysteries that you can solve with logic alone. And this is written by, this card is by Do Delicious, a lady called Sarah Kappa. So you can see her email address if you want, her website if you want to get some of them. She's got loads. I send them to loads of people. I love them. So I've written, to understand the Melissae, you have to understand what it means to be a woman locked in a cave, responsible for the very future of divinity, with a chaotic and willful child, with a destiny who will change humanity, isolated but cosseted by the earth, heavy with duty. And so these women, what are they doing with themselves all day? Well, we know that Melissae were particularly good at agriculture stuff and also spinning stuff. Anybody who does some sort of face-to-face training with me, there's a lot of spinners mysteries in the Melissae. So women's arts, sewing, musing, spinning, they enclose memory in a different space. And so I use these as a way to get inside the myth. Today we're bypassing the bedtime stories to join the ancient lineages inside of the cave. So first of all, we should look at Zeus, I think, because I think that this is a really important aspect. We learn about this a lot in classical studies. This is a beautiful, beautiful representation. It's a Roman statue, I think, of Zeus. And we see him like that. Got this beautiful limestone appearance because all of the painting has been taken of him. And this sort of narrative of everything being white would lead eventually, particularly in sort of Victorian times, to a narrative of white supremacist in museums. And so that the white supremacy, these civilizations that had these white carvings were civilized, and everything outside of those were not civilized. And so that is challenged quite a lot in classical studies now. So what's interesting to see is we know that Zeus had black hair or black blue hair. So his name here is Zeus Kaienoi, and which is what Homer calls him, and it means with the dark blue black hair, Kaienoi. So that's what I was drawing that, and I was colouring it in, and I was like, okay. Somebody else was coming out the page, somebody that I grew up with. I was like, I've got to stop now because that looks too much like Mandia. But it was a very strange experience. But yeah, he's a very fit looking bloke, isn't he? Right. So let's think about these caves. So as I say, there are two caves in the tradition. We should also say that although this is accepted as being Zeus, and he will become the Olympian god is immortal. The Olympian gods are immortal. You know, that's what the myths say to us. But the myths about Zeus and his birth, and with the Melissae in them, say that he is a dying and rising god. So he has a very specific couple of names, particularly Zeus Cretogenus, which means born on Crete. And in subsequent episodes, we'll interrogate this, that even people back in ancient Greece were like, well, it can't be both, can he? So don't try and engage your brain in it, because even ancient Greece went, no, that doesn't make sense. But what we can see is it's very likely that what's happened is a much older myth, a much older set of knowledge was usurped and used as part of his story. We call this syncretization. And so when we look at these caves, not only do we see the time where Zeus was worshipped, but then we can also see that there are offerings and things that go way, way further back than that, to Minoan times. And that it seems likely that what we're seeing is a story about Zeus that was originally about a Minoan god called Belonikos. And so we'll talk about each one as we go. So if you have a look at the map, you can see that they're quite close together because Crete is not very big, 16 miles long. At the narrowest point, it's 7.5 miles wide and 37 miles wide at the widest point. So it's not a very big island, but it's far enough apart that we can say that these are two different times of the same tradition. So we know that this story was a worship story for 2,000 years, right up to Roman times. And I'll tell the story just in case people don't know this, just to kind of centre it. What happened in 391 was that the Emperor Theodosius, very sort of influenced by Constantine I, who had run a very Christian ship, so to speak, decided that his part in this would be to close down all pagan sanctuaries. It became illegal to have a pagan sanctuary. We see lots of things closing at that time. So the Vestal Virgins came to an end, the Oracle of Delphi came to an end, and also this tradition came to an end. What happens though in many of those places, so for example, the final Vestal Virgin in Rome, she was a lady called Concordia, and Concordia became a Christian. So they kind of, I don't think they go through these massive conversions, but they kind of take the tradition and learning with them and operate in a different way. So we can see when they end quite suddenly, but as I say, we can see really when they began to. So the older of the two traditions is Mount Dicte and the Dictean Cave, and that'll be the first one that we study. Such a fascinating place. But then it will move later to the Dictean Cave or the Dictean Cave. So the Dictean Cave seems older, and it looks like the worship transferred from one to the other around about 8th century BCE. And probably because it's more central, we know that the Dictean Cave was really high up in the hills. You can still visit it. So it was really massive trek up and then a massive trek down. So perhaps they want something more centralized. But also, if you study sort of the geographic or the geological makeup of the Dictean Cave, you can just see that it's kind of almost like a hall that can hold lots more people as well. So I think that is really interesting and a useful thing to think about. But both were really old, and yeah. So what it is. So the other thing to tell you is that sometimes if you are going to study this, and you're looking for the Dictean Cave, like I did, you can run out of references. So when that happens, you look for it under another name, which is the Psychro Cave, which sounds terrible, doesn't it? But it's Psychro, and that is because of where it is. Psychro is the area that's in, so the Psychro Cave. So suddenly once you know that, you're like, oh my goodness, there's loads more people talking about it that I can draw on. That's really quite interesting. But we particularly if you look in the 19th century, they seem to prefer to call it a Psychro Cave, and that's a lot of when they were doing the archaeology. And so if you're looking for archaeological evidence, use the word Psychro Cave, and that takes you to the Dictean Cave. So we should tell you that the myth really begins with Hesiod in theogony, and theogony is a lot about this sort of fight between the Olympians and the Titans. And he says that Rhea, the goddess Rhea, so Zeus's mother, gave birth to Zeus in Lictus, and he hid him. So Lictus is the area that it's in, and that's where Mount Dicte is. Excuse me. You might notice that I have highlighted Alephanice, and if you'd watched the video where I show the goddess, the nymphs in their golden representations on the gold seals. There was one where there was like a current, I don't know if you remember, where there was like a crisscross current, and you can see that crisscross current in the water on the seal. And we know that that crisscross current happens particularly in Alephanae, and so the chances are those priestesses were there, although I don't see much representation of them otherwise, but I think it's fairly certain that they are dancing on the beach there. So it's interesting to see how that sort of lies on Crete. So I'm going to skip forward several pages to show you him in the Dictean Cave. So I got very sad thinking about this little boy in a massive cave full of stalactites and potentially throwing thunderbolts about, although the stories tell us that happens later, that the Cyclops gave him the thunderbolt when he freed them after he came out the cave. So perhaps he didn't have a thunderbolt in the cave. We do know that he had a ball, a golden ball that's got a blue spiral on it, and I'll do a video just about the golden ball. Yeah, what's he doing all day? How are they keeping this poor kid happy? And incidentally, this page here, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it because it didn't print very well because of the lighting, but it is all lit up green. This is the inside of the Dictean Cave as you see it now. You can see that it's very deep, and it has great big stalactites and stalagmites coming up, actually, really important stalagmites. It's a colossal place, and if ever there was a place that you would hide a god, it's into the belly of the earth, I think. And what I love about this, and don't forget that this tradition has hidden elements that are definitely a woman's tradition that a man definitely wouldn't get, right? But we know that he was buried into the cave on the advice of Rhea's mother, so his grandmother, who is Gaia, who is the earth, and Uranus, who is the sky. And they both say, well, if you are going to try and do something about Cronus, his father, swallowing all his children, you need to hide him in this cave. So they seem to have some knowledge, not only hide him in this cave, but with the Melissae. So they seem to have some knowledge that this is something that happens, and that it's older. But I really love the fact that he is being put back into his grandmother's womb. And that is like a sacred woman's thing, isn't it? That when you have a daughter and that daughter is growing eggs and in her ovaries, and they are forming, you are carrying your grandchild, right? And I really love that maybe they kind of perceived that already, and they told that story secretly away from the blokes, you know. So let's have a look. So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, the geology. So the walls of the Dictean Cave are entirely changed by groundwater that has trickled through and down the rocks. And it really reminds me of a description that Homer uses of another cave of the nymphs, when he finally reaches home back to Ithaca. So I'm hoping that if you're watching these, you're also thinking you'll go and watch Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, because that's what we're recording to now. And when he finally reaches back to Ithaca in the story, he's been gone for 10 years. Odysseus, the first thing he does before he races home to his wife, because she's surrounded by suitors and he's got to have to overcome them, is he goes to see the nymphs. And the nymphs are like he gives thanks to them that they are the spirit of the place that he's come from. He's gone back home, and his representation of home, of the spirit of place of home, is his nymphs. And he says, unable to believe that after all the challenges he'd faced on his 20-year adventure to get home, this might finally be it. So begs Athena for reassurance, and she takes him to the cave of the nymphs, which is also full of bees, and tells how the nymphs weave in looms of stone. That's what she says, they weave in looms of stone. You can see how these might be looms of stone, right? And I've been fascinated to discover that amongst all the archaeological treasures found in this sacred site, there were indeed needles. They seem to have no purpose whatsoever, but there's lots and lots of needles in there. So it makes me think of weaving and looms of stone. So this is a sacred place, sacred to Zeus, but for long, long before, sacred to Potnia, the Minoan mother goddess. So speleological comment. Goodness me, if you'd have asked me to come up with that word off the top of my head, I would not have been able to. But speleological means to do with the geology. The astonishing geological miracles that are the result of the chemical reaction between trees and rocks. Outside, rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and soil, tree respiration, obviously, which then turns the water droplets into a very weak solution of carbonic acid, which then dissolves calcium carbonate, which is the lime scale of the rocks. So it dissolves it and it changes it. And so for over hundreds of thousands of years, these drips have then deposited minerals and drips and created these icicle structures. And then similarly, as water evaporates, carbon dioxide then changes the floor, leaving deposits that are built upwards to make stalactites. And I've written to remind myself, mites go up, tights go down. That's how I was taught at school. When the two meet, so if you've got mites, stalagmites going up, stalactites coming down, they make columns, and there's lots of columns, like almost like a cathedral inside. So the cave, the Dictean Cave, is vast. It measures 2,200 meters squared, and the tourist path goes down around about 250 meters to get into the cave. And the opening is 18 meters wide by 14 meters high. So it's big, right? It's really big. The layout of the sanctuary. Notice I'm saying sanctuary. We're not talking about a story. We're talking about the actual archaeological evidence. It's like saying how the church inside is laid out. It has an antechamber, a large hall, an underground lake, and smaller alcoves, including the chamber where Rhea was believed to have laboured with Zeus, accompanied by the dactyls, who were associated with blacksmiths, and they were supposed to have helped her labour pains. So evidence shows that the ritual worship associated with the site took place in the antechamber, so at the front. Foundations of an altar have been found, as well as several libation tables. A large collection of ash pays testament to the sacrifices made here, as well as votive offerings that were made in lower parts of the cave. So votive offerings of thanks, usually to say thank you for delivering my prayer. So sacrifices are made upstairs, but then you go into the more intimate area downstairs and say thank you for what you did for me. The central hall is gargantuan, entirely covered in stalagmites and stalactites and rock structures. In the far left of this niche is where Zeus was historically believed to have been born. A second chamber exists deeper underground, accessed by a staircase of around about 200 steps, with dramatic stalactites and stalagmites that divide up a small subterranean lake, and an area traditionally known as the Bed of Zeus. So he slept on these stalactites. No, stalagmites go up. See, it's useful. So the stalagmites came up, he slept on the stalagmites. The lower cave hosts many kinds of bats and troglodytic insects, arthropods, which thrive in the humid environment, which ranges between 15 to 16 degrees centigrade, which is 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So why am I interested in temperature? Well, that I'm looking for beehive temperature, and we'll talk about that another time, but that's why these details are there, because I'm looking for beehive temperature, the temperature that can sustain honey. Yeah. The mantle of Zeus, a large, spectacular, folded stalactite that looks like a pleated coat. Try again. The mantle of Zeus, a large, spectacular, folded stalactite that looks like a pleated cape or a pleated cloak, overlooks the lake. Then there are a number of smaller chambers in darker spaces, and situated at an altitude of 1,025 meters on the eastern side of the Dictean Cave. So you put your hive to face east because that's where it gets the earliest sun, the dawn sun, so it would be lit in the mornings. The cave faces north to survey the most incredible vista of the Lassiti plateau. If it would face south, it would have been too hot. So it's really interesting how, are these coincidences or were they deliberately done that way? I can tell you that you would always face a beehive east, so it's very interesting to see that they did that. And of course, we might also think, yeah, but the bees probably, I would say, the bees were probably there before the gods, and the bees are probably woven in stone because there's so many places and nooks and crannies that they could build beautiful long honeycombs, and they've probably chosen that cave because it faces east and it shelters, it's not too hot, it's probably got ideal properties for them to be in there, guarded from all the elements and able to make these really long honeycombs full of honey, full of bees. I'm sure it probably hummed in there long before somebody actually said, oh, there's a goddess in there, that's why. I think probably the bees were there because they would choose that site. So, religious significance. We know that the site has been in continuous use for over 6,000 years. The earliest Neolithic time, people lived in it, but it was also a burial site. And you might think about how bees are the psychopomps of the dead, right? So the ancients really believed that the bees took away old souls and brought in new souls. You can see that everywhere, and we'll do a specific video about that. But you might also think about how we talked about how bees are born from bulls and bulls are sacrificed, right? So this is a place of death in a way, but it's also a place of rebirth. So the fact that it was a burial site is really interesting to me. Then in Minoan times up to archaic times, this is a worship site. First of the mother goddess, then of the child Zeus, and his mothers and nursemaids, presumably. At this time, this was one of the most important pilgrimage sites of the ancient Mediterranean. Worship continued sporadically into Roman times because Zeus became Jupiter and Jove, that's his other name, up to the point where the pagan sanctuaries were closed by Theodosius. Despite Christianization in the area, local legend endured that this is where the boy god was raised. And interestingly, even like you can see it in the Christian times, early Christian times, they're still talking about this is the place where the pagan god was born. So how did we find it? Because I always love these stories, right? It's thought that shepherds had been using the cave to shelter their goats and pigeons since around the 16th century. So clearly it had gone into disrepair, but we can find records and talk of them being in there and also knowing what the cave was. So this is not like, oh, they've discovered this thing. Everybody always knew that this was a place of God. But centuries of misuse had meant that great sections of the ceiling had fallen in. But in 1883, the goat hands uncovered Minoan pottery, and the first bronzes were found on the floor. Eager to find a market from ancient dealers and visiting archaeologists, local farmers started to dig, find treasure and flog it. Because you would, right? It became clear that time was against them, and official more sanctioned archaeology was needed to commence. So initial investigations were led by Joseph Hatzidakis, I can't say it, Hatzidakis maybe, and Federico Halbert in 1886, and then followed by Sir Arthur Evans in 1896. If you don't know, he's the person that discovered the Minoan civilization, and he was the head curator at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. David George Hogarth of the British School at Athens led the first major excavations in 1899 in 1900. So looting meant that significant artefacts had already been lost, unfortunately, before the official excavations started. Some were subsequently recovered through private sales. Many were purchased by Arthur Evans. If you read any of his work, he really he was on the island on Crete for such a long time. He would always have his eyes out for these. In particular, a kind of double axe. He made a big study of all the places he could find this double axe, which we now think is the sign of the priestess in the area. So this double axe becomes interesting. Excuse me. And finds were mainly divided up between the Ashmolean and the Herculean museums, so on Crete and back in England. We won't debate why that's good or bad. You'll hear from my tone of my voice why I think that it might not be ideal that they are in English museums, but it's to my advantage that I get to see all of these things much easier than flying to Crete, I have to say. But that is a whole other argument. So in the Neolithic, in the early Minoan, 6000 to 2200, people lived in the cave, used it as a burial site. Minoan and Archaic periods, which is 2000 to 700 BCE, it becomes a cult sanctuary, or we should say temenos. Temenos means that the area that is sacred. So that might not just be the cave itself, the area itself is often the temenos. And then in classical and Roman eras, worship and ex voto continued until Roman closures. So people worshipped, they continued to give offerings right up to it was closed. So what kind of archaeological recoveries? Well, first of all, clay and bronze statuettes, including a young, beardless Dictean Zeus. So he's not the great big hairy bloke we saw at the beginning. He's beardless, he's very thin and nubile, very athletic, and he's like a teenage and adolescent Zeus that's worshipped there. Countless double axes, the labrys. I wish I'd put a picture of those for you, but I haven't. Figurines, spearheads, knives, razors and pins. Now, I have to say, I'm always getting asked what I think the labrys is, which is the double axe. Now that I've really thought about what's going on in this particular cave, and I'm not thinking about it from a priestess point of view, I'm thinking at it from a cave point of view, and the bees, I think they used it to get the honeycombs out of the stalactites. That's what I think, but you couldn't prove that, I don't think. But yeah, that's an interesting video to look at, because you can see them represented all over the place, and it's always the priestess that's carrying the labrys, even though it's an axe. It's not a man's implement, it's a woman's, which makes me think that this is a sacred implement, right? And honeycomb, of course, perhaps we should centre that. It's not just a food, it's food for the gods, right? So what has the priestess got a responsibility to do? To provide honey for the god. And how's she going to do that in that cave? I think her job is to pull them down bravely in amongst all of those bees and feed the god. I think that's what that is. What else? Gold and silver garlands, gems with depictions of bulls and goats. Obviously the goat goddess, Almathea. What are bulls doing in there? What are bees born from? Bees are born from bulls, right? Necklace beads, rings and jewellery. So just want to centre that a little bit. Depends. This bees are born from bulls is a Grecian belief. It belongs in classical Greece. It doesn't belong in Minoan Greece. They didn't believe that in Minoan times. Oh, I can't see evidence that they did. So if there's bulls in there and it's an offering to Zeus, potentially bees are born from bulls. If it's Minoan, it's more likely that that's the god fructifying the goddess, yeah. And so that's like a fertility symbol. So they mean different things depending on whether they're in there, which is really strange because, of course, it's just, you could say, oh, well, a bull was sacrificed in that cave. So what, right? You've really got to know what to look for as to, well, is the message congruent between the two times? And the answer to that is no, it's not congruent. They mean different things at different times. What else? Ceramic cups, beautiful jugs and oil jars called arybalos. So I talked about how Zeus had a ball. We know he had a ball to play with in the cave, and I talked about how that is a separate video because it's very difficult to follow. But I can show you that some of the offerings, the oil bottles, oddly, interesting for aromatherapists to know this, seem to depict that magical ball. And I think, and nobody else has said this as far as I know, but I think that the magical ball is actually a code for the priestesses. So over time we'll be able to see that, but that's quite a like extended thread. But I think that it's two priestesses that it's talking about, this ball. So I think that these are kind of codes when you see the offering. Then also a very large altar, a rectangular stone altar, which you can still see today, which is 3 foot high, and it was covered in thick layers of ashes containing the balls of sacrificed bulls, of sheep, goats, deer, and even a dog. It's funny how your brain goes, oh, that's okay, that's okay, that's okay, that's not okay. It's very strange, isn't it? It's cultural priming. It's thought that one of the sets of the bull horns that was found, so it's an actual bull's head with the horns, was actually the front of the altar. So when you went in, the altar was there and it had bull horns on the front. But then also, when you go into the rest of the sanctuary, there's all these libation tables. What's a libation table? Well, a libation table is where you get a libation, and a libation is a sacred offering of a drink or a fluid. And so what libations would we have in these early caves? Minoan times, classical Zeus. Well, if it was Dionysus, we'd probably say grapes, although there are mead stories, but definitely this is a mead place. This is a place where we drink mead. It's a place of honey. It's a place of the priestesses with all the bees around them, right? So these are offerings of mead, probably, as opposed to water, or maybe milk and honey. That would make sense. You know, you've got Almathea, who's the goat goddess, and you've got the Melissae. Milk and honey would make sense, but we certainly would expect it would be honey here, as opposed to wine. And think about it, 30 different sites around the place. So the chances are either there's loads of libations or there's loads of people having these libations. We can't really discern that, but one of the two. Numerous bronze daggers, double axes and arrowheads, beads, needles, spinning wheels, so like drop spindles, and weights for the thread, and seals that show the priestess rituals. So as I say, you might have seen some of these golden seals where you can see the priestess is actually showing their rituals. And then there are inscriptions bearing Linear A language. And sadly, so far, nobody knows what that says because nobody can read Linear A. But when that finally happens, the chances are there will be all sorts of information that we can suddenly go back and go, what else do we know? But so far, Linear A is too old to know, and we don't know what it means. But archaeologists have noted that the majority of the votive offerings are more consistent with goddess worship than they are with Zeus's mythology. So therefore, are they worshipping Potnia? Are they worshipping Rhea, maybe, because we know she is a bee goddess, that she is seen as being Melissae, or maybe a goddess called Adrasteia, who we know becomes a Minoan Melissa. Sorry, she becomes a Melissa, Adrasteia, but we also know that she's a Cretan rock goddess. She's a mountain goddess. So potentially either the offerings are to her or maybe to Potnia, but probably not to Zeus himself. And these ones to Zeus seem to appear in the upper layers of debris, which pertain to later periods. So even if those offerings were to a goddess or to a divinity, they're not the real deep ones. They're not from Minoan times. They may be to a Minoan deity, but as the debris has built up, we can see them in the top layers. So even at the time of Zeus, we have to ask, were the offerings to Zeus, or were they to Rhea, or were they to the Melissae and to Almathea? It's really interesting, isn't it? So in the next video, I'm going to go more into the actual myth about why he was in there, and show you some of the details of the myths. So I will see you in the next video, when we'll talk about the Coretes as much as anything else. See you in the next one. So if you've enjoyed that, a couple of extra notes. If you were interested in the bits and pieces that I have put into the journal, I've created a PDF that you can download with all of the notes. You can find those on the blog post. If you look in the link in the description, click to the blog post, and there'll be you can download the PDF with all my artwork and stuff in it. If you want to cut it out and use it, or use this as your file, you are most welcome. Of course, we've been talking about the nymphs, but you may also be interested in the priestesses who were trained by the nymphs, and you can find out about those in my book. Meeting the Melissae, the ancient Greek bee priestesses of Demeter, is published by O Books, and you can find it anywhere where they sell books. And finally, this is a series of videos, a course if you like. It's in one long playlist. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss any, obviously subscribe, please like and comment, and make sure that you subscribe to the series to be able to see more through. Also, YouTube has started to give a little bit of help to certain creators, of which one of whom I am lucky to be. If you look underneath the video, there's the option to hype it, and that says, I've really liked this video and I think other people will like it too, and it helps the algorithm to trust my content a little more, and it will show it to more people. It costs you nothing, and so if you've got the hype button and you can click it, that will really help me a lot. So yeah, I hope that you enjoy this, and I'll see you in the next episode.